Καλημέρα. Καλώς μας ήρθατε. Είμαστε ευτυχείς που είμαστε εδώ μαζί σας. So I would like to welcome all of you in the Institute of Mediterranean Studies, the Foundation of Research and Technology, and here in Rethymno. We're very happy to have you here. And I'm extremely happy as well to start this collaboration with Tour de Force here, Irini Karamuzi. Thank you, Irini, for all these ideas and new field as well for me. And we hope to go on and see you again. I would like to tell you a few things about where we are. We are the Institute for Mediterranean, one of the 9 institutes of the Foundation of Research and Technology. Now, the Foundation of Research and Technology is an independent research center, and we are the only humanities institute. There's only another, apart from the Academy of Greece, there's only another humanities institute, which is the National Research, Hellenic Research Foundation, okay, Εθνικό Ίδρυμα Ερευνών, and us, right? So this is mainly a science foundation, and I'm not bragging when you will find this here. We are the first among the research centers in Greece in all comparative evaluations conducted by international committees. We are the first in the ranking web of research centers, and in Greece, and we are the 17th among 50 top European research centers in attracting competitive funding. We have the research, so we have an Institute of Electronic Structure and Laser. For culture, it is the institute that developed all the technology to clean the marble of Parthenon. But of course, they do a lot of other things with industry. We have an Institute of Molecular Biology and Biotechnology. We have an Institute of Medical Biology, Institute of Computer Science. This is the largest and richest. It is the one that introduced internet in Greece, has domain names. It has, it really services all ministries, hospitals, and name it. Institute of Applied and Computational Mathematics, and Institute of Chemical Engineering and Sciences, Institute of Astrophysics, and us. Now, here in the Institute for Mediterranean Studies, we are very happy and proud to have very successful research groups. We have 10 research groups. Now, research centers do not work like universities where you have departments. It is research groups, and research groups go on if they have funding to go on, okay? So this is an institute, this is a foundation of the private foundation of what we call the wider public domain. So we do have researchers that are paid by the government. We have also administrators, but so these are researchers and 3 administrators, but we have 120 researchers in the institute, all paid by our research projects. We have about 26 research projects from European funding, from national funding, from private funding, and we have a budget of all these research projects of about 10 to 11 million euros. So for humanities, we are very proud and happy, and we have been very successful in ERC projects. From 2016 to today, we have had 6 ERC projects. If you know what they are the best sort of more competitive research funding. And we are doing very well in attracting funds. But we attract funds not for funding, but for culture and history, which we serve. And we are very proud to be a host institution of postdocs. And we have the means to educate them how to apply for projects, also train them in our research projects, and they learn and they go on. Okay, so 10 research groups in history and culture. In Ottoman studies, we're the first research and only research group in Ottoman studies. Has also a master's in an English master's with the University of Crete. We have a global and economic history research group. We have a diaspora and the history of the cities research group. We have the Center of Maritime History, which is my domain. We have history of technology. We have in culture, history of art, history of cinema, history of theater. We have the best collection, archival collection from 1830s to 1940s of all theatrical plays in the Eastern Mediterranean Black Sea. We have a now promising and rapidly growing research group in ancient and Byzantine history that got an advanced grant, advanced ERC grant, that got in slave history and so on. In philosophy, we do a series of seminars in philosophy and also in ancient literature. And the laboratory of geophysics, satellite navigation, and archaeoenvironment. And this is a very successful as well research group, which collaborates with archaeologists, and it is a point of reference for all the archaeological FORIAs, which I don't know how you call this, so, in schools. So this is where we are, and we want to promote history of tourism as well, and which is not very very well researched or progressed or developed. So that's all from me. I'm sure we will have a very a wonderful meeting, and I'm glad to meet you all. So, Irene.
Okay. Unfortunately, whoever presents has to come here because we're live streaming, but we'll try to keep it as informal as possible nonetheless. Okay, hi, my name is Irene Karamouzi. I'm an associate professor of contemporary history at the American College of Greece and the University of Sheffield. Just a very quick kind of, to give you a backdrop of how this idea came up and what we're trying to do, so you get a sense. You just saw a call for papers, but there was a lot of thought behind it. And also, as you know, in humanities, there was a huge effort to get funding, which is not always successful, but in this case, we're able to kind of make it happen with the support of the IMS and Zelina Harlaftis. We are a scientific committee. Please go and say hi to them. It's Mary Koniadou. I hope she's wearing her name tag so you can see her. It's Professor Vasilis Bambakas, who is there. It's Professor Panagis Panagiotopoulos, who is in the back and is waving. And of course, Professor Zelina Harlaftis. We came up with this idea because we are coming from different disciplines. So we have a business historian, a communication specialist, a sociologist, a visual arts expert, and we're trying from different kind of backgrounds to approach this question of nation branding. I'm sure that the marketing people here will kill us the way we are using the term, but we'll hopefully dive into this kind of different vernaculars that we're speaking, and we're actually speaking the same language, but we just don't understand that that's the case. But I think we have to be more precise, and this was part of the idea. We were having problems in finding a common language to communicate, and the more we were researching and the more we were thinking about how to construct this project, the more it was coming, more to the forefront on how to truly build an interdisciplinary network. It's a huge feat, and that you really need to speak to one another. So we're really proud today. We really have an interdisciplinary group. So bear with each other's differences. We have business historians, socio and cultural historians, political scientists, sociologists, architects, visual arts, design experts. I hope I'm not marketing and tourist experts, people who have worked in the sector. So it gives you kind of a glimpse of how we've tried to regulate this. Having said that, it's very easy to write about the interdisciplinarity to get funding or to get published, but to actually put it in practice is a very different kind of animal. So that is the whole idea. We tried really to try to do this. So just a little bit about the project. We are a group of, as we said, different people from different disciplines that we have applied for funding. We're waiting to hear back. It's a big kind of grant, but we're also applying for seed money here and there. Part of a result of this is this conference, but other things will follow as well. Primarily because I'm the primary investigator, we are trying first to historicize, as you will see. Nation branding is a new term for us historians. We haven't been using it, but we're using other terms to describe it. But now we're trying to delve into this kind of terminology to see if it's holistic enough to try to explain about these different ideas on how it's a feature of post-45. This is the period that we're looking at of tourism, which is the phenomenon of mass tourism, to reveal its cultural, societal, and ideational connections and implications. So that was part of the kind of the one overwhelming objective. But also we wanted really to shed light to Mediterranean Europe as a whole, which is the second big objective. How can we talk to one another from different Southern European countries? There is the tourist gaze, there's the Western gaze, but we're really not looking inwards and seeing how the Southern European countries look at each other, how they project themselves to the outside world, how do they project themselves to their supposed competitors. So really that goes back to this kind of ongoing saga about what it means to be Southern European, what it means Mediterranean Europe. How can we really kind of encapsulate that in the best epistemological way to be able to get as much results as possible. So really in this conference, I really want you to think about that term and how much, if you're talking from a Greek perspective over Portuguese or Spanish, how can we really, or Cyprus or Malta, there are different kind of ideas. How do we discuss or think about the Mediterranean, not just from the outside view, but also from inside. And therefore, with this kind of attempt, try to bring Southern Europe as part of this pan-European global connections. This has happened in other kind of parts of history with social movements. We see that much more, but there's much less advancement in disciplines like history of tourism, leisure, and consumption, which is part of what we're doing here. The other third element is try to establish the agency behind nation branding. The idea was that we want to really understand all these different stakeholders that we usually ignore. So not just government, actually non-government, also, you will see that as we go along, also for your presentations, from creative directors to graphic designers to marketing executives, there is an array of people that actually set out what seems to be either an intended or not intended specific image of the country. And we want to kind of explore that historically, especially for this conference that goes up to 1990. But also what we were seeing by going through the press as a project is that we were really trying to look at the interplay between the public, the domestic, the local public, and the kind of image that is projected on the outside. Because usually much of the literature is focusing on how foreigners are consuming, but there's not so much about how the locals themselves are negotiating, are discussing about how this image is being projected. And methodologically, that is the big issue for us. How can we do that in a way that's scientifically robust? There is a lot of cherry picking in our discipline, and hopefully we'll try with this conference to find different ways from different disciplines that we can, take note and learn from each other, so we can get a better sense of the local. So this is really, if you see it, it goes from the local, the national to the global, and it's truly such kind of a story that we want to kind of talk about. And the third one, it's kind of alluded already, is that really we want to create a network. This is just the beginning. We'll create this kind of as I said, group of people that we want to keep talking and involve each other into what they're doing, their publications, their research. This is just the beginning of hopefully would be a network that will be growing for people who are in some ways working on this topic. And you see that from our different kind of panels. And just in terms of the questions, you know that this was the questions that you had in the conference. We really kind of emulated what we had in the project. And what we have as an outcome, just so you know, hopefully we'll get a special issue out of this conference, which would be really great to be able to manifest to the outside world what we've been doing for the past months. But also, and I want you to keep note of that, we are building a digital archive of the history of tourism for Mediterranean Europe. We've started with Greece because, well, part of the team are mostly Greeks, and that was where our strength lies, but we really want to use that as an educational and research tool. That is the goal, and I will write to you as we go along on what would be. Already I've seen from your presentations, you have amazing material that is simply not accessible to the rest. So one of the problems we have identified is the lack of primary sources of how to go about doing that, especially in the long durée, and not just on a specific period. And the other thing which we want to do is create a witness seminar series. It's an oral history project in other ways with different kind of stakeholders that will be able to also upload on our archive and use it as a primary source. So this is something that could be used from another generation of researchers as we go along. So that's the ultimate goal. Okay, enough from me. Some housekeeping rules. We have to stick on time because we have a packed schedule. And I know that we're in beautiful Rethymno and you don't want to be locked up in this room. So let's try to keep it as it is. Therefore, I want the discussants to be brutal. You have 20 minutes each to present. Then the discussant will discuss the papers for 10 minutes at the most, and then we open it up to the public. We have circulated the papers on the Dropbox link. I hope you had some time to look at them so we can have a very kind of robust discussion afterwards. So every time, also to remember that this is a hybrid event. 3 of our presenters are online, and also some people are also following online. So we'll try to incorporate them as much as possible if they have questions or anything else. I hope that is it. We're already running out of time, but that's our mistake. So hopefully we'll catch up. If you have any questions, do let us know, and we're very happy to host you here. So let's have the first panel come. Okay, thank you. Yeah, here it is. And you sit here, and then you can sit down. Okay, all of the first panel needs to come up.
I just gave the example.
So Adelina, please, in the morning, and come up.
Oh, yeah, so close to here.
Okay, they need to bring the speaker closer. So, yeah. Also, they cannot hear from as I say here.
Yes, we need the microphone, be conscious of the microphone and just keep it.
Right. 1, 2, 1, 2. Yep.
Just make sure to share screen also. Just 1 second.
Yep.
Please remember to share.
Guys, we're not going to do a long introduction of bios. You have it in your back, so please see who it is, so we don't lose time on that. You can introduce yourself. That's okay, so we start?
Shall we? Yeah. Okay, hello and welcome. First of all, I would like to thank both Irini and Jelena for accepting my proposal to this wonderful conference. I do realize it's somewhat of a responsibility to be the first to speak, which I gladly accept, but it is perhaps an even greater for me, since after 10 years, after a good decade of working on 19th century policing and the age of revolutions in particular, now this is my very first talk referring to the 20th century and the Cold War in particular. So it is a quite telling coincidence, I would say. Nonetheless, I've been working on policing and the police for quite a long time. Therefore, this is quite, I believe, fruitful opportunity to try and combine two seemingly at first irrelevant institutions and practices, that is tourism on the one hand and policing on the other. And I do think that their combination is feasible, since in Greece and also elsewhere in the world, there is this sub-branch, sub-institution of the police called tourist police, in particular, which I'm going to investigate in what follows. And to be more precise, I intend to look at the police in order to use it as a window for broader issues. First of all, to examine the institutional and legal parameters that enabled the rise of policing, in the rise of tourism in Greece, and in addition to that, try and assess and examine the overarching policies of the Greek state vis-à-vis security and tourism throughout the 20th century. This topic includes certain challenges as well. The difficulty of accessing state police archives that actually demands from us to be more resourceful and use private archives, regional archives, foreign ones, and so on and so forth. Which also entails the other parameter, the other adjustment to the wider topic of this conference, of playing a little bit with periodization as well. Therefore, I'm going to expand somewhat the conventional time limitations of the Cold War and begin from the mid-1930s, the establishment of the terrorist police back then, and end up in the early to mid-1990s. Let's proceed. Okay. Now, the development of the state tourist policies in Greece actually emerged in the early 20th century with the establishment of the so-called Bureau of Foreigners and Exhibitions by 1914. And yet, it was only about 20 years later that the first serious initiatives, systematic initiatives for the establishment of tourism in Greece really kicked off, took place. With the establishment, the first one, of the Greek Tourist Organization, 1929, and what's most relevant for us, the establishment of the tourist police to help exactly enforce tourist regulations in Greece in 1935, which is, if you think about that, an aspect of wider police modernization projects in Greece in the interwar period, beginning with the establishment of the city's police in the 1920s, following the appropriate British models. The very first head and director of the tourist police in Greece, and the person which is going to, trouble us a lot in what is to come, was Nikolaos Neris, a devoted policeman and an able administrator who would be the head of this state service for the following 20 years or so, until the mid-1950s. Neris put as his primary goal, his core aim, to establish what he called a tourist consciousness in Greece. And to do so, he needed, in his own perception, to, first of all, change the aesthetic standards that characterized the main Greek urban centers as well as islands in order to make them more aesthetically pleasing for the incoming tourists. To use his own words to change this mess, as he wrote, I dreamt of tourism and made the tourist police in Greece. Or to put it in Greece, to change this chalya, this mess, I create tourism and the tourist police in Greece. Of course, the definition of a mess is highly subjective and is based on a particular Western, if I may say so, aesthetic canon. Therefore, as a basic precondition for the establishment of tourism and the tourist police in Greece, we may unravel, we may reveal certain, if I may say so, crypto-colonial and self-orientalist premises. Therefore, according to the Western aesthetic standard, these images from downtown Athens in the interwar period in the 1930s were a mess, were aesthetically displeasing, and therefore they had to change to conform with what was considered appropriate. And the tourist police was, of course, nothing else but the executive branch that would bring this plan to fruition. For Neris, the tourist police was nothing less but a force of civilization, as he would put it, a civilizing force, nonetheless. Yet another familiar term to the studies of colonialism and Orientalism. A key aspect of the state apparatus that would essentially force interwar and later Greece onto modernity. And therefore, after 1935, we have different tourist police branches in the main Greek urban centers, including Athens, Piraeus, Patras, Corfu, and elsewhere. State measures that had actually a mixed reception on behalf of the Greek public. The lower social strata, so to speak, felt somewhat pressed by the new regulations, while the middle and upper classes, in a certain sense of way, welcomed them, providing the necessary popular legitimization for the project. Or, as we can see in the press of the time, we are being civilized. The 1930s, late 1930s press claimed, argued. To do so, to achieve the creation of a modern, for the standards of the time, tourist police, Neris sought inspiration abroad, therefore further strengthening, maintaining certain routes of knowledge transfer, so to speak, and also certain routes of knowledge dependency. Neris, in the late interwar period, traveled extensively abroad, including to Italy, 1938, and the USA in 1939, exactly to extract ideas of how tourism and the tourist police was organized over there in order to implement later on these plans in Greece. An adamant supporter of the Metaxas regime and also of the Mussolini fascist regime in Italy, we should mention that too, Neris was highly impressed by what he understood as a highly effective and efficient material advancement in the neighboring Italian state, which he hoped, he aimed to implement, to duplicate in Greece as well. He was less impressed by the ideological framework of the USA, which he regarded as excessively democratic, in his own words, and somewhat foreign and dangerous for traditional Greek morals. And yet these ambitions of advancing tourism in Greece, furthermore, and also expanding the tourist police, received a violent damage in the 1940s, as we all know, since World War II and later on the Civil War, actually disrupted highly this experimentation, this process of state formation. However, if we try to take a step back and try and trace and analyze longer-term state continuities, we can actually trace, we can realize that in the mid to late 1940s, Neris, who in the meantime got reinstalled in his place after the end of the Axis occupation, tried actually to keep up, to continue his plans despite the large-scale disruption due to wartime violence and devastation. For Neris, to use once again his own words, the decades between 1947, so early Cold War, so to speak, so 1947 and 1957 was a golden era, a golden age of creativity, where he had the place, the institutional position, as well as the resources to finally implement his aims under peacetime conditions. Next to native Greek plans, fostered by Neris above all, he also had the generous material help, of course, of the Marshall Plans. The Americans were very much interested in supporting, in giving a boost to tourism in Greece, and therefore maintaining and safe and secure institutional apparatus fitted also their longer-term priorities as the American advisor for tourist development in Greece, T.L. Christie, would have it. Both foreign powers and the Greek governments favored tourism as a way to create the necessary influx of foreign currency in Greece and also maintain and advance the building of works of infrastructure. In his early Cold War plans in the mid to late 1940s, Neris focused especially on the tourist development of major islands and urban centers. Athens, Piraeus, Mykonos increasingly, Rhodes, and Corfu feature prominently in his plans, therefore giving us the impression of a highly specialized plan to develop tourism. The tourist police in its post-war form was highly favored by the generous material assistance that especially the American police mission in Greece between 1956 and 1966 gave it, especially through training and material support, especially to be more precise, through English courses and new motorcycles. Later on, as the post-war period progressed in the 1950s and 60s, Neris and the overall, direction team of the tourist police branch favored and prioritized high-level services, professionalism, politeness, knowledge of foreign languages, as well as of the history and customs of Greece, in particular regions of Greece, were highly important, highly useful to them in order to create the necessary ecosystem on behalf of the state for Greece to exactly embrace the tourists and adapt tourism. Neris, of course, didn't forget his interwar aim, the one of the police having the role of the civilizing force, of a force of civilization. In that case, that aim was twofold. On the one hand, the police had first and foremost to civilize itself, so to speak, so to build a robust apparatus, so to speak, of professional policemen following the adequate standards and morals. And second, to use that personal example through their training exactly to be a force of civilization for the rest of the Greeks, for the rest of the nation, in order exactly to create a critical mass of population to be able to accept tourists. Next to this, we should not forget that in the mid to late 1940s, Greece has was in its last phase of territorial expansion. And with that, I mean, of course, the annexation of the Dodecanese. An event, a development that did not pass unnoticed from Neris, who focused especially in Rhodes and the Dodecanese, and argued that in this particular case, the tourist police was not only a force to civilize, but also a tool to enhance, to advance nation building and boost the national consciousness of the inlanders, of the Dodecanese people. Therefore, doing justice to the third component of our title, that is nation building. Furthermore, as we proceed to the 1960s, the military dictatorship of the 1970s, we see that the new media, especially the television and the movies, the cinema, was used by the then regime, the junta, the dictatorial regime, in order exactly to demonstrate that Greece was actually not only a pleasant, but a safe destination where the police would guide the tourists and show them the correct Greece, right? The proper Greece, quite picturesque and of course politically safe for foreigners to come. And if I can devote just a few seconds to show a very, very short, I know.
There's no hotel once there. Well, that can prove the luckiest event of your trip. Every Greek island has a tourist policeman who meets all incoming boats.
Yes, of course. Come with me.
He'll escort you to a guest-accepting private home where the cost of bed and breakfast can average $2 per person.
Quite enough. So we can also have a look at the aesthetics of the regime, trying exactly to portray that image of a safe Greece when, in a paternalistic manner, if you wish, the police officer would escort actually tourists to their proper, aesthetically, politically, socially proper destinations. Okay? Later on, as developments and circumstances, that's better. Yeah. As developments and historical eras went on, and we slightly entered the 1980s, and especially the post-Cold War world, we can also see further developments, further adjustments to the nature and duties of the tourist police. And here we can see a most interesting aspect, characteristic, I would say, of the nature of police work in general, that is that policing and the police can actually have a highly fluid nature, I would say, has no specific duties. The tourist police also fits this example because next to its formal duties, in the 1990s, from what I found in the archives, it was used for various other on-the-spot and ad hoc purposes, including providing safety for high-level international visitors in Greece, such as heads of state, keeping an eye for foreigners due to their fluency in languages in demonstrations, and especially against international terrorism, particularly in the 80s and the 90s, where international terrorism was considered to be an issue, and eventually keeping also an eye for illegal immigration, especially from former Eastern Bloc countries, and especially when it comes to northern and northwestern Greece, close to the borders with Albania, Fyrom, North Macedonia, and Bulgaria. Since I don't have much time left, I will quickly bring it to a conclusion and simply summarize, saying that once again, I hope to have argued in a satisfactory manner that the tourist police allow us to comprehend, to understand in an adequate way the overarching state policies vis-à-vis security and tourism in 20th century Greece. It allows us to understand the process and personal careers of state builders and state operators such as Neris, and also see how the police especially was used as a vehicle of social mobility for its staff in particular. The tourist police has allowed us to understand how the state perceives, has used to perceive, and perhaps still does nowadays, the so-called process of civilization, of introducing new norms into the society. What are the aesthetically proper, the aesthetically correct standards as understood by the Greek state throughout the 20th century, and how the Greek state comprehended and understood a process of educating its population. And finally, we have understood and seen how the police can actually be a multifarious institution, how it can have many different faces and be used for many different purposes next to its formal one. At this point, I believe I've exhausted my time, quite a lot, by a minute, I think, and therefore trying to be accurate, and therefore I would like to put an end here. Thank you all very much for your attention. Looking forward to your comments.
Okay, so. Okay, good morning to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I would like to thank the organizers for inviting me to this interesting conference that I'm sure that I'm going to learn a lot from other speakers and from the debate. What I'm presenting today is a paper on the development of Gibraltar, this British overseas territory, as a tourist destination during the Cold War. So it's a work in progress, so please don't expect so much, but I will welcome your comments and questions to improve my paper. Basically, what I'm covering is 2 points. Well, this monkey is not a joke, or it's not an innuendo. It's basically a symbol of Gibraltar, and a symbol of the Britishness of Gibraltar. So basically, this is a postcard. So what I'm covering in this presentation is basically 3 points. The first one is the relationship between tourism and colonialism. As probably you know, most research works on this relationship. They stress that tourism is a new form of colonialism that preserves previous domination relations and subordination. So, so basically, most of these authors say that tourism prevents also former colonies and colonies to develop their own identity, that they struggle to develop their own identity. So I will talk also about identity and agency. And the question basically is, can colonial or host communities with colonial past to develop their own identity through tourism? Can they use tourism to develop their own identity? So this is the main question that I'm trying to answer in this presentation through the specific case of Gibraltar. Let's talk about Gibraltar. As you see here, Gibraltar is a very tiny territory in the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. It's a very small territory, around 3 square miles, with a population of 38,000 people. For the period that we are looking at, it was just 22,000 people. And it became a British colony in the 18th century, at the beginning of the 18th century, during the War of Spanish Succession. So basically, the Spanish crown ceded this territory to Britain. And since then, the successive Spanish governments have been claiming to recover sovereignty over the territory. So there has been a diplomatic dispute since then. As you can see there, Gibraltar is, there is a huge mountain that is called the Rock, and in the middle, and is connected to mainland Spain through a small istmo. So it's a kind of peninsula, and it's bordering with La Línea de la Concepción, a Spanish, the closest Spanish city. And Gibraltar was basically a garrison, a naval base for the Royal Navy, for the British Royal Navy, for a very long time, until the Second World War. So after the Second World War, it became a tourist destination, and this is what we are looking at today. And there was a huge transformation of this place during the Cold War. So as I said, in the beginning of the 20th century, Gibraltar tourism industry was quite basic. It was developed by some cruiser lines that were organizing travel trips around the Mediterranean. So the colonial authorities created this hotel, the Rock Hotel, and they promoted tourism, but considering or projecting this image of Gibraltar as a delightful little corner of the empire. So there was a kind of basic tourism infrastructure, but still in this period, in the interwar period, was still Gibraltar was still a garrison, naval base. What happened during the Second World War was that Francisco Franco, came into power in Spain after he won the Spanish Civil War, and he established a dictatorship in Spain, and he started to claim or to assert the Spanish claim to sovereignty over Gibraltar. So he launched a diplomatic campaign, and he organized some demonstrations in Spain, for example, with this slogan that is Gibraltar Español, that means Gibraltar is Spanish. So he started to press or to press the UK in order to negotiate the future of Gibraltar. Things got so much worse when the Elizabeth II, the new queen, visited Gibraltar during the famous royal tour, and she visited Gibraltar. So Franco didn't like this visit, so he impose severe restrictions to border mobility at the Gibraltar frontier. So basically, these restrictions started to be a problem for Gibraltar economy. And at that time, the Gibraltarian authorities, the colonial authorities, were developing the basic tourism infrastructure in Gibraltar. As you can see, this is one of the hotels that they created, that is the Queen's Hotel. And also in the 1960s, Spain was also developing its tourism, and Gibraltar was benefiting from this development. Basically, Gibraltar was welcoming some British people who went to visit Spain, as they had a huge airport in Gibraltar that was for military services, but started to be used for tourism too in this period. In fact, they created a new terminal, and they also created these new buildings, like a hotel there. You have a hotel there that is the Caleta Palace Hotel in Catalan Bay, and also these apartments that is in Sandy Bay, and they are called the both worlds. That is this idea of you know, Gibraltar has the best of both worlds, the best of Britain and the best of the Mediterranean Europe. So as Gibraltarian tourism was going up, what Franco started to do was to impose new restrictions to border mobility in the 60s, in 1964 and 1967. And this is usually called in Gibraltar a hot summer, because every summer they have new restrictions, and that obviously had a huge impact, a negative impact, obviously, in Gibraltarian economy, but also in particularly in tourism. In 1965, the UN Special Committee on Decolonization recommended Spain and the UK to negotiate the future of Gibraltar, and in order to provide Gibraltar with self-governing institutions. So what the British government decided to do is to call Gibraltarians for a referendum in 1967. And as you can see here in this image, Gibraltarians started, the days before the referendum, they started to develop or to perform, if you prefer, their Britishness, because until 1950s, most Gibraltarians were monolingual in Spanish. They share kinship ties to their Spanish neighbors in La Línea de la Concepción. So, but the situation, this Spanish threat, this Franco campaign, pushed them to develop their identity as British. So they voted to remain under the Union Jack flag in 1967, and they say something like, the slogan was British we are, British we stay. And in 1969, they created this constitutional law to get some self-governing institutions. As you can see, I put this image here that is from a travel agency in Gibraltar, Gibraltar Rock Tours, that they use the same image or a similar image to the one of the referendum. So this idea that this Britishness can be used to tourism and to promote Gibraltar as a tourist destination. So what happened next is that Franco in 1969 decided to close the border. All communications were shut, and consequently, obviously, the arrivals started to drop. As you can see there, in 1967, there were almost 500,000 visitors, and in 1970, there were only 140,000 visitors. So the number of visitors start to drop dramatically. And also the profile of the visitor or the profile of the tourists started to change. Most of the visitors were now Britons, were now from the UK and from Ireland. So also Gibraltar and Gibraltar tourism promoters had to adapt their promotion to this new profile. So what they did was to create this idea that Gibraltar was a British territory in Mediterranean Europe, and they have the same advantages that you could have in the UK, but with Mediterranean weather. So the slogan was something like, where the sun is Mediterranean, the language is English, and a pound is still a pound. So also like a pound is still a pound. They try to say that they still keep the traditions. So and you can see in these postcards, not just only the photographs, but also, I don't know if you see that it says Gibraltar, the Sterling destination in the sun. So the Sterling holidays in the sun. So and they have like a kind of a sun with the rock inside, like saying, okay, we are Britain in Mediterranean weather. It's pretty much the idea. So they also had support from different British personalities during the blockade, because the blockade lasted for 13 years. So John Lennon and Yoko Ono married in Gibraltar. Also, the royal family visited Gibraltar, and they started, or Gibraltarian authorities, they started to say that, well, that visiting Gibraltar was a kind of a patriotic action. So so many British tourists who came to Gibraltar in this period, they say that they also were coming to visit Gibraltar because patriotic reasons or patriotic purposes. In 1982, the Spanish government and the British government reached an agreement, and finally the border was reopened. And as Gibraltarians were developing their tourism industry during the previous years, so as you can see here, there was a huge increase in the number of visitors, and they reached the same figure that they had in 1967 by 1919. So finally, to conclude with my presentation, just to say two conclusions. The first one is that in the late 1960s, tourism branding campaigns started to advertise Gibraltar as a cultural melting pot. This idea that is British past Mediterranean. This mixture was revealed as a useful discursive tool to highlight the singularity of this community within a geographical area, the Mediterranean. and in the shadows of an Anglo-Spanish dispute over the territory. They try to distinguish themselves from Spain, from Spanish culture. So the case of Gibraltar shows that in the building of a successful destination brand, the host people might stress their colonial heritage to assert a distinctive identity within the cultural landscape in which they are located. So basically, they stress these colonial roots in order to show that they are different to other people that surrounded them. So basically, this is my presentation. So thank you very much.
Hello, thank you very much for accepting my presentation in such an interesting conference like this. For me, it's an honor to be here. First of all, I'd like to apologize for first of all, I'd like to apologize for not speaking Greek, but as well, I'd like to apologize for my poor English. So that's the reason why I will be reading my presentation. I will refugee myself under my papers. Okay. What I want to present today is the case of Mallorca and the relationship between not only between branding or between nation branding and tourism, but as well the relationship with politics. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Okay, I didn't know. I was right. It's okay now?
Yes.
Perfect. Does it work? That's it. Perfect. Well, since the first democratic municipal elections after Francoism in 1979, until the approval of the Statute of Autonomy of the Balearic Islands in 1983, the political debate in the following decades in Mallorca has revolved around the preservation of the autochthonous culture, especially Catalan language, and the consumption of territory by the economic model based on the monoculture of tourism. The insular identity adopted from right-winged positions, mainly identified with Spanish nationalism and Francoist tourist development, has been countered by the left-winged one, culturally Catalanist and environmentally ecologist. Therefore, from the 1983 until the first victory of the left-wing parties in the autonomous elections of 1999, the opposition to the conservative government of Partido Popular has been led by civil society organizations oriented toward the defense of Catalan language and of the island's cultural difference, such Obra Cultural Balear, or against the construction of coastal resource and the preservation of natural space, such the Group d'Ornithologia Balear, GOB. In this paper, we connect the convergence of these organizations' demands to the political left with the different tourist brands on which Mallorca has been historically constructed as a travel destination. Since the anthropologist Michel Picard's classic studies on the island of Bali, tourism has not only been seen as a practice of cultural standardization, but also as a device to produce differentiated local identities designed as objects of consumption for visitors. From the perspective of critical tourist studies, Nigel Morgan and Annette Pritchard have studied tourism along the same perspective, as a practice of consumption of countries whereby new local identities based on travelers' yearning for exoticism has been created as consumer brands. The unequal social relations that emerge in the process of producing countries as travel destinations have been well studied in this field of knowledge, but the traditional divorce between political mobilization and everyday tourist practice has provoked the neglect of the consequences of tourist identities on local political cultures. For the case of Mallorca, this paper explains the touristic origins of the political identities corresponding to both right and left-wing poles of public opinion on the island. In the case of political identity of the conservative right, its tourist matrix may seem obvious, since the discourse is based on the apology of tourism growth that began with the boom of the 1960s, when the desarrollista policies projected by the Franco regime were implemented. Under the slogan, Spain is different, the dictatorship not only promoted the Fordist mass tourism model as a policy of soft diplomacy with the aim of gaining international acceptance, it also promoted the old Spanish national identity based on the Andalusian stereotype from the banality of sand and beach tourism consumption. Although Mallorca brand as a tourist destination never disappeared, it did come under the umbrella of the Spanish national standards at this time. As a consequence, in a context of growing identification in the Spanish nation with the modernity and tourist development implied, the local brand was associated through cinema and mass communication with Andalusian stereotypes of Spanishness, such as flamenco or sevillanas, far removed from the life experience of its inhabitants and their previous regional identity. This could explain why in Mallorca, tourist development and the Spanish nationalism go hand in hand in the island's political right wing. More paradoxical seems to be the key role played by tourist imaginaries in the process of shaping the Mallorca's left-wing political identity, a self-perceived option of opposition to tourist development and defense of the authenticity projected onto both the natural landscape and the local culture. In relation to that, it is worth noting that a key moment in the genesis of the environmental movement in the island was the first screening in Palma in 1970 of the BBC documentary Mallorca Observed, which warned of the damage to the island, wild fauna and flora caused by the massive construction of coastal reserves for tourist accommodation. The film was made at the initiative of a group of British ornithologists who had been spending their holidays in Mallorca since the mid-1960s, staying at the Hotel Pollentia in Port de Pollença, where the local Society for Protection of Birds, the Royal Society for Protection of Birds, booked their organized trips thanks to contacts with British residents living in this part of the island. These visitors, attracted by a non-seasonal tourism alternative to the massive offer of sun and beach, saw their ornitho-holidays threatened by the environmental degradation associated with the tourist growth itself. And the viewing of the documentary played a key role for a group of local students who initiate the environmental movement in Mallorca, creating the GOP, later in 1973. Apparently, the appreciation of the island natural ecosystems from the BBC's Northern European perspective had a positive impact on them and boosted their self-esteem. Consequently, when one of the British directors of the documentary, it is Richard Brock, it's this guy. When Richard Brock gave them a tape of the film, they decided to go on an island-wide tour to screen the documentary in schools and cultural centers in all the island parishes. Therefore, the tourist imagination of Mallorca as a lost paradise seems to be key in the historical configuration of the island's left-wing identity, despite its British origin. And this, in this sense, it is worth noting that the contrast between the modern Mallorca associated with mass-Fordist tourism and the pre-tourist island identified with an authentic and charmly and the developed peasantry is a constant in the visual narrative of the BBC documentary. This binary opposition is reproduced, for example, when images of tourists on the beach sunbathing are followed by images of a traditional farmer's market where local people sell fruit and vegetables. I think it's better, because of the time, it's better not to see the images, but we can imagine. While in the first images, the song Paradise of Love, recorded in 1964 by the local electric pop band Los Jabaloyas, plays in the background, in the second scene, the flutes and acoustic guitars of the Mallorcan folk group Los Valldemossa can be heard. So the music always as well performed this kind of binary opposition. The inclusion of the old indigenous peasant, culture in the paradise, threatened by mass tourism in the BBC documentary, is confirmed by the intertextual play that its title establishes with the book Mallorca Observed by Robert Graves, with the book with the same name. Published in 1964, in it, the British writer already described the island as a paradise lost due to mass tourism. Graves arrived to Mallorca in 1929, following the footsteps of other compatriots and colleagues such as D.H. Lawrence on his way to Sardinia. And he bought in the small village of Dea, located in front of the sea, in the northern mountains of the island, he bought a house. In his original Mallorca Observed, Graves did not express an ecological or an ecologist concern with environmental degradation. His longing for paradise lost referred to the fact that the overcrowding and modernization of Mallorca has destroyed the tranquility and charm of the old peasant society. Okay. Okay. Well, yes, that's my what I count in. When from the 1960s onward, the differential fact of Mallorca as a travel destination began to fade under the standards of for the sun and beach tourism, Graves expressed in Mallorca Observed a sense of loss of his place of retreat where he could escape from modernity. In fact, both Graves and the BBC were merely claiming the previous tourist brand of the Mallorca that predated the Spain is different of Franco Desarrollismo. It was in the island tourist brand, largely alien to Spanish national identity, that began to take shape with the visit of Georges Sand and Frédéric Chopin during the winter of 1837 and 1838, which had its epicenter in the mountain village of Valldemossa. In this sense, the great architect of this previous tourist brand of the island was the Archduke Ludwig Salvator. This member of the Austrian imperial family visited Mallorca from the first time in 1867 as part of a naturalist expedition. Thanks to his long stays in the island, he was able to write and publish between 1969 and 1891 his 6-volume magnum opus, Die Balearen, probably the most complete ethnography of the archipelago. The old tourist brand of Mallorca prior to the Fordist and Francoist boom was finally consecrated in 1913 with the publication of the book L'Illa de la Calma, in whose pages to Barcelona painter Santiago Rusiñol took the representation of the island as a paradise of tranquility. In fact, the first environmental concerns about the island in the face of tourist development came from his pen. In his writings, corresponding to his stay on the island after the first, expressing the more aesthetic than ecological concern about the railway building plan for enabling tourists to visit the more inaccessible villages in the mountains. As a result of these first environmentalist groups in Mallorca, which emerged around the local student movement in the 1970s, merely picked up and reproduced in their political culture the old tourist brand of the island as a paradise of beautiful landscapes and cultural authenticity. Faced with the trauma of the quick modernizing change, they revived the old romantic identity of Mallorca as a travel destination, just as Robert Graves or the ornithologist or the Royal Society for Protection of Birds have done before. the young members of the GOB reacted to the eruption of mass tourism by countering the old tourist stereotype of unhistorical calm and tranquility. In this sense, the incipient local environmental movement was not only concerned about the degradation of natural ecosystems caused by tourist development, they were also concerned about the cultural dangers of the new mass tourism, which made the old regional identity invisible under the umbrella of modern sun and beach standard, nationalized in terms of Andalusian Spanishness. All this can be seen in the local newspaper Diario de Mallorca, where the group of youngsters who originated the GOB established the identity of the island environmental movement in a section of his own entitled Defensa de la Naturaleza, regularly published between 1970 and 1978. And I finished. In conclusion, we can say that the identity of the Mallorcan New Left that took shape during the late Francoist period and the transition to democracy does not stem to any great extent from the persistence of the pre-dictatorship working class left-wing culture or from the old peasant culture prior to the tourist boom. We'd rather think that to an important extent, it has its origins in the adoption of the new educated generations of the popular classes of the old romantic tourist brand of Mallorca as the island of calm and as a natural paradise and as a sanctuary of cultural particularity. And this could be perhaps a sad or a pessimistic conclusion, but we have to take into account at the same time the process of appropriation from below of the tourist identity, in which the identity, the local identity, the identity of Mallorca has been de-touristified, decolonized, and at the same time politicized. And that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Yeah. All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for bearing with me with these technical problems. Yes. All right. So my presentation building leisure spaces on the Romanian Black Sea coast and the Spanish Costa del Sol is part of my book project that examines the politics and impact of international tourism in socialist Romania and Franco Spain between 1950s and 1970s. And I'm particularly interested in how and why these countries with opposite economic and political systems choose to develop international tourism. To what extent did they reach the expected results, and how did the arrival of foreign tourists affect the relationship between state and citizens, given that both of them were dictatorships? So for this presentation, I'm trying to answer, the main question I'm trying to answer is, how did the arrival of foreign tourists influence consumption habits, fashion and social mores in the Spanish Costa del Sol and the Romanian Black Sea coast? And my argument here is that the construction of these two tourist areas as leisure spaces was not just the work of the two states, planners and developers, but also of tourists themselves. So in both places, luxurious and but also mid-range hotels were built to welcome foreign tourists rather than domestic tourists. Yet, the Romanian tourists were still made the majority of tourists in some resorts on the Romanian Black Sea coast. And this is the Romanian Black Sea coast, as you can see, with the main city being Constanța. Mamaia, north to Constanța, was mostly populated by foreign tourists, but for instance, Eforie, which is south to Constanța, was it was more common for Romanians, especially people who went on vacation via trade unions to be seen there. And here you have in the south you have Mangalia, okay, around which in the late 1960s a new tourist let's say hub was built with one main important resort called Neptune, after the god the Roman sea god. So that was this is the Romanian sea coast. Okay, so this was how things were in Romania. Well, in Spain also, although initially it was the coast was Costa del Sol was mostly populated by foreign tourists. It was also Spanish tourists who started to come, especially in the 60s, when the economic one. Okay, we have one thing that is anyway. This led to encounters that helped both Romanians and Spaniards to have access to cultural artifacts, experiences, or fashions that were more difficult to obtain in inland Romania or Spain. That is why the two states and their agents attempted to regulate contacts between foreign tourists and either Romanians or Spaniards. These attempts were obviously stronger in the Romanian case. But despite this intended separation of space, about which I actually talk more in my written paper, so I won't go much into this here, interactions happened and went behind the limits set by the regime. I will start with the Romanian case and then move to the Spanish one. And for Romania, I will start with an interview I took in Neptune, so resort north to Mangalia. This interview is with former bellboy. He started as a bellboy, now he runs his own hotel. So post-socialist Romania, right? He remembers that there were discos which were specially meant for Western tourists because the entrance fee was in dollars or Deutschmarks. So at least theoretically, it would have been difficult for Romanians or even East European tourists who didn't own this kind of currency to get into these discos. But, well, he's saying that, in fact, things were a bit different. And he said, well, although the entrance fee in the discos frequented by foreign tourists was paid in dollars, at times the locals had free entrance simply because they knew the doorman. So the informal relations that developed in these places somehow overcame the limitations that the state, the Romanian state, wanted to impose on these interactions. However, the Romanian state, obviously, Romanian authorities were not happy about this. And the reasons were, in fact, economic, first and foremost. As I said, the entrance fee was in US dollars or Deutschmarks, and the Romanian state attempted to get as much foreign hard currency as possible. This is why I've actually developed tourism in the first place. So more Romanians in these discos meant actually fewer foreigners, so fewer revenues. This is why the authorities would respond to these small illegalities with increased surveillance. And during the high season, the high tourist season, more militia and Securitate, Securitate was the secret police, was detached on the seaside. So a 1977 report by the Ministry of Interior noted this, and here we have a quotation. So 54 officers from the foreign language school were included among the tourist guides or employed in order to solve various problems in the security work. In addition, 2 surveillance teams, 8 officers from the technical operative unit, and 45 officers specialized in economic and financial crimes, so all of them subordinated to the Securitate, went to the seaside to help with the surveillance work. Well, despite the surveillance, relations between foreigners and Romanians persisted. And among the most common of these relations were economic exchanges, such as gift giving. Gifts are part of a ritualistic relationship between tourist workers and foreign tourists in many geographical settings and historical contexts. In the particular context of economic shortages of socialist Romania, gifts played an important role in binding the relationships between foreign tourists and tourist workers. In socialist Romania over 1960s and 70s and 80s, gift giving had both social and economic meanings and was part of an intricate communication process between foreign tourists and tourist workers. And I have another interview here, oral history interview I took with Alexandra this time, and she worked as a waitress in a restaurant of a 3-star hotel in Neptune, so the same resort. And she remembered how tourists would ask her every year what kind of presents she would like to receive. And I quote, tourists would always ask, what should I bring you next year when I'm coming back? And you would have said, well, bring me some chocolate or some stockings or some perfume. It varied according to each one's preferences and needs. As Caroline Humphrey argued in her study about personal property in socialist Mongolia, material possession matters, and it holds both identity and ritualistic significance in one's life. Regardless of how insignificant the gifts that tourist workers received from foreign tourists were, they were extremely meaningful in the context of a consumer goods shortage in socialist Romania of the 1970s and especially 80s. For tourist workers, these goods opened a window onto a world that was not physically accessible to them, as they could not easily travel to Western countries. Okay, now we'll move to Spain. Although the Francoist regime did little to discourage the interactions between foreign tourists and Spaniards, it did try to channel tourists into activities that involved more proper behavior and dress so as to meet the moral requirements of a conservative Francoist regime. From the point of view of Spanish tourist authorities, foreign tourists should adjust to the local customs. Officials expected tourists to wear appropriate outfits when going to the beach or visiting towns, and these boundaries applied to women more than to men. For instance, the Spanish State Tourist Office in London recommended British female tourists to avoid wearing a two-piece bathing suit when going to the beach, and advised tourists of both genders to not wear shorts while walking in towns. And here we have a quotation. So although in some popular Mediterranean seaside resorts, a two-piece bathing suit is not strictly prohibited, ladies are nevertheless requested to wear one-piece bathing suit. Slacks, jeans, shorts may be worn in seaside villages. Both ladies and gentlemen are requested not to wear shorts while visiting towns. Although strapless sundresses may be worn on the beaches, it is advisable to cover the shoulders with jackets or stole in the towns. When visiting churches and the religious buildings, ladies should wear skirts, and bear in mind that it is customary to have arms and head covered. So this was included in a tourist guide in 1966, Your Guide to the Costa del Sol, and was literally taken from the Spanish State Tourist Office brochures. So the Spanish tourist officials feared that local women could adopt similar fashions that went against the still powerful Spanish Catholic Church recommendations. In the early 1960s, some Spanish women, especially in smaller towns, would still avoid to go alone or in a mixed group in a cafe, as one article in the New York Times about Costa del Sol noticed. And here you have a quotation. So just before lunch and again in late afternoon, visitors and local men, but never local women, gather at one or two outdoor cafes to sit under the trees and drink coffee or wine. So this is New York Times from 1965. Yet the change was underway, and foreign tourists did shake the traditional Spanish society that Franco's regime and the Catholic Church supported. Carmelo Pelejero, a university professor at the University of Malaga, whom I interviewed, and who was a teenager in the early 1970s, noted that women and young people were the first to embrace the transformation. And he says, I mostly recall changes in the way of dressing, women picking up smoking, overall different habits that changed the Spanish society. What was the Spanish state response? Well, the Franco's regime had in fact few alternatives to this invasion of tourists, which was otherwise beneficial to its economy. And Pelejero believes that the state had to choose between losing the tourists and the money that they brought with them and accepting the potential moral harm that tourists posed. And you have his opinion about this. So there were many politicians who feared the tourists and this change in mentalities. The choice, however, was between giving up the visas and assuming the risks. It wasn't easy, but the idea of accepting tourism and the tourists won out. Slowly, you realize that at the end of the 1950s and well into the 1960s, the church would often take a position against the bikini, the long hair, and the customs that came from outside. The state's resistance, however, melted when the money showed up. This conundrum hasn't necessarily passed unnoticed in the popular culture, and a sketch by Monty Python in 1972, Travel Tourist Agent, you may be familiar with it, actually mocked this. Well, and meanwhile, the Bloody Guardia are busy arresting 16-year-olds for kissing in the streets and shooting anyone under 19 who doesn't like Franco. So the Spanish state chose to try to contain the potential corrosive influence of foreign tourists and convey the appearance of freedom as long as tourists did not engage in political activities or openly express their criticism of the Franco's regime. However, it did act in a paternalistic way in relation to the Spanish citizens who were told to refrain from imitating the foreigners and constantly reminded that this invasion, in scare quotes, was economically motivated. Despite the different political regime in Spain, this stance was in fact quite similar to the one in Romania, which used paternalism, patriotism, and the needs of a socialist state as weapons to justify its surveillance over ordinary citizens. To conclude, while in Romania, economic interactions were the ones to call the attention of a regime as the state was striving to turn tourism into a lucrative activity, but also to prove the superiority of socialism over capitalism as a political and economic system, in Spain, the moral concerns prevailed. However, these were dropped when the Spanish authorities began to see tourism as a way to overcome economic crisis and as a source of divisas. In Romania, also, the economic exchanges between foreign tourists and Romanians helped to alleviate the shortages from the official economy and, as a paradox, appeased people's discontent vis-a-vis the communist regime economic policies. Well, thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, guys, thank you so much. I'll try, we only have half an hour, unfortunately, but I'll try to kind of give my comments and open the floor for questions. I'm sure that there will be a lot of them. What I think was interesting in the panel, I've read the papers, of course, and I won't go into depth because unfortunately we don't have as much time. But one of the things that came up when we were at least constructing the panel and until we saw the papers was this idea of how exactly we should be looking at tourist practices. So the first of all is who is in charge of this practice, and that's a very complicated question, and it's a matrix even to actually figure it out. And you have decided to concentrate on specific individuals or agencies, but I think I would invite you to tell us and think about it a little bit. Who and why did you decide to focus on? Why is that seems to be quite revealing of this tourist practice that makes sense? And this goes for every and each of the papers, because you seem to be focusing either environmental groups or a specific director or doing interviews with people on the ground. Therefore, there's different kind of focus. And I think it's important for us to kind of reflect on why we focused on this specific groups, what seems to be drawing our attention to them. And the second aspect of this tourist practices, of course, is how they are consumed. Therefore, there seems to be a huge discrepancy in all cases of what they were trying to do and what they end up having. So first of all, there doesn't seem to be a master plan. And for us, it's important to remember this. They have a vision, which it's important for us to clarify, but that vision is multi-complicated and multifactorial. So therefore, because it has different audiences, it's for us to really hard to pin down. And I think that's why in most tourist studies, you don't get a very clear international relations. A lot of you mentioned do tourism, the more the Cold War fades away in my analysis as a lens through which to make sense of these practices. So therefore, the second kind of theme that connects the papers has to do with this consumption and how exactly do we measure that? And same question as the people who create the practices, who are we looking that they are consuming it? And I think if we ask these questions quite more prevalent, we'll be able to get better results, because every time it seems that they were targeting a different audience and that audience was consuming it in a different way. Although it seems to be an attempt to be at a national level that actually it's not what you get. So kind of zooming in each paper, starting with Christos and the tourist police. I mean, I have two basic questions, I guess, because I didn't know how much power did the tourist police really have? I mean, and I asking that as devil's advocate. I think there is a very interesting element that we tend to forget in terms of, what people were encountering when they were coming to Greece. Actually, that there was a director and they were one of the stakeholders that had a say in what kind of image Greece should have. But my question is how important they were, and how exactly you see their role. Were there space for them to have an opinion? Because you seem to be focusing on this character, which actually I find fascinating. Because you say in your paper he comes from a low background, working class, found his way up, which is he's a great example of the social mobility you've been talking about. He makes it up the ranks, and he has, in a way, a say in formulating some form of tourist practice, which is very interesting because you don't get that familiar story of people ingrained into the system. So that's, I have a million other questions, but that's for Christos. And then for Louis, what I was kind of amazed, it seems that Gibraltar is only focusing on the UK. It seems that their visitors are only or mostly from the UK. Is that the case? So really, there seems to be an outward projection, but really this is a dialogue between the colonizer and the colonized. And what it seems to be interesting is that we see much more the colonizer and much less the colonized in terms of how I read it. And I was wondering if that's the case. It seems that they are saying what the British want to hear, but where exactly, I mean, I was reading the paper and I was thinking about it, where exactly does Gibraltar, what is really unique about Gibraltar besides the fact that it's so connected to the Brits? They don't seem to really, at least from what you presented, they don't seem to even care about that, but just to accommodate the British tourists. And you're right, you are kind of touching upon all this great literature that talks about domestication of tourism to make them feel at home. This is a constant concern during this post-war period. It's not just about looking for exoticism and authenticity, it's also to feel very comfortable. That's why most kind of resorts become so popular, because they tell you, come here, but you will still feel at home. You will hear the same language. You will do the same kind of activities. It just, you will do it under the Mediterranean sun. So that was kind of my question. And then Tony, of course, I was wondering, how important was this environmental party? Am I pronouncing GAP? What is their name? Sorry, DOP. The reason why I'm asking you, I was wondering, why did you focus on them? And I think it's very interesting because this kind of binary between authenticity and mass tourism, it's really, you see it everywhere. This kind of dichotomy, cultural dichotomy, is really much the message you get across all of these countries. So I wonder, how are they able to really appropriate that message and make it distinct? Because it doesn't sound completely, I've seen that on the Greek case again and again. Actually, they're embracing this kind of, oh, look at this pastoral life, but also look at this amazing modern building we have. You sell both, and that are not contradictory, because that's what people want. So I wonder, how are they becoming successful? If they're becoming successful, because it wasn't really clear from your paper, how are they able to penetrate at least mainstream, or if they do, and how it's picked up by popular culture, so therefore it becomes part of the agenda, especially especially because what I liked about your paper is that it is kind of partaking in this discussion of transitology, but looking it through tourist practices, which you don't see as much. You see it much more under Franco. And last but not least, Adeline, I mean, I really love the comparison, and it begs the question that the dictatorships are not that different if you're on both sides of the Iron Curtain in terms of practices. But it seems that the question is, do they really, I mean, I saw through your PhD, and I guess didn't come up at the paper as well, but I was thinking, is at least at the top, the expectation that they can control this, even when Romania goes again conservative in the 1980s just to control it more? Is that even possible? And what is also interesting is that what you see as tourist practice, I really love this idea of this gift exchange, because there is a sense of gratitude that we barely think about as an emotion and as an element. And I think it's very interesting that you find it as part of the consumption of the tourist product. And I've never seen that as much. Do the tourists feel a sense of gratitude for being there? And because you mentioned that, it's quite striking from what they're saying. And do the people who are working, so they are part of the tourist industry, and of course have no say in how it's planned, but they are actually implementing it on the ground, if they also feel gratitude, because it seemed from the interview that they didn't like this gift giving, actually. They felt it was quite patronizing. So it's interesting to see this kind of how it's actually that tourist product is consumed. I have much, much more. Thank you so much for the papers. And as soon as you're done, you can answer whatever you want. I can open it up to the audience. Is that okay? Who wants to start first?
Since I've got the microphone. Okay, so it's working, I believe. Right. Thank you very much, Irene, both for your very insightful general comments and for the more specific ones. First of all, when it comes to the general ones of who are the actors who we're focusing on, yes, this is also, I would have to say, a practical issue depending on the availability of our sources, because usually, and that's not the case only with Greece, but also elsewhere, regardless of the East and Western divide, the state is usually doing a very good job in hiding itself, I would say. And who's taking the decision, who's behind what, whether it has to do with positive or with negative outcomes. The second question had to do with actually how much power the tourist police held. At this point, it's important to clarify that tourist policemen were not, coming out of a different, so to speak, worm, out of a different point of origin from everybody else. They were also members of the city's police and of the gendarmerie, with some additional, of course, qualifications such as language learning and so on. And at this point, it is important to mention another term, I would say an overarching one throughout all of our papers, that is the issue of negotiation, right? Negotiation and osmosis. And in this case, we don't only have to do with negotiation between state and society, but also within the state itself. So different state services are negotiating, are having a competition, so to speak, a rivalry with one another of who is going to hold more power within the state, who's going to be closer within the real decision-making centers. We can see that between, say, the tourist police and the more conservative gendarmerie, so to speak, in Greece. And we can also see that when it comes to individual personalities, such as Neris, so the director of the tourist police, who later on, indeed, managed to rise up and become the chief of the city's police. But that also has to do, as in most cases, with personal connections. Quite important back then, quite important nowadays, I would speculate. And his very close connection with the Greek royal family in the post-war period. Another important issue regarding personal routes, personal trajectories, so to speak, is one of my final points regarding social mobility. I think it's a highly important one because I have noticed that both in the Greek case, in the Romanian one, which also interests me, and I believe also the Spanish, the Italian one, and so on, that in the post-war period, in the Cold War, the security forces and the coercion mechanism are repeatedly used for social mobility purposes. So people from agricultural or labor backgrounds using the police in order exactly to rise up, and even police those who are socially above them in a hierarchical way, so to speak. So once again, mobility, negotiation, the availability of sources, and I believe that was all you asked.
Thank you so much. Who wants to go next?
Okay, first of all, thanks for your questions and your comments that I find extremely useful. The general question was who is in charge now? Who are these groups that we are looking at? I think, from my point of view, tourism is a kind of negotiation between the locals, the host community, and the tourists, the visitors, that they negotiate a product, a simple product that usually is not related to historical facts, historical realities. But usually in the case of post-colonial and colonial and post-colonial context, usually historiography pays so much attention to the colonial authorities and also the visitors who represent colonial imaginaries, etc., etc. But they don't attribute so much agency to colonial or colonized people or host communities, and that was the the aim of my paper to try to look at this this host community, the Gibraltarian people, what they try to create through tourism, how they use tourism, etc., etc. That was pretty much my idea. That I don't know if I could achieve that, but it was the intention. And the question of what makes Gibraltar a unique place. Well, it's very
What they're trying to say.
it's a very complicated question. But if we look at Gibraltar at the beginning of the 20th century, and in fact, when we were interviewing people there, most people, very old people, used to say, well, in those days, we didn't pay attention to national identity or anything like that. We just were struggling to getting by. So, you know, we didn't pay attention to that. But after World War II, with this threat from Spain, they starting to develop an identity, and was at the same time that tourism was starting to grew in Gibraltar. So there was a narrative that it came from colonial authorities, but Gibraltarians used it a lot in order to distinguish themselves from Spaniards. There was this idea of multiculturalism, that we are a multicultural place, and that we can distinguish ourselves from Spaniards, from our neighbors, because we are, you know, very multicultural, because we are British, but also Mediterranean, not Spanish, but Mediterranean. And so they try to emphasize this multicultural idea, that it was also useful to get the support from the UK, and also from these tourists from the UK. And obviously most of the tourists came from the UK, Ireland, etc. But it wasn't the case before the border closed. There were so many tourists from Spain, particularly excursions, etc., that went to Gibraltar, also not just to visit Gibraltar in terms of tourism, but also to buy, I don't know, like low tax products like cigarettes, alcohol. That is the case to nowadays too. So in fact, one of the reasons why the tourism grew exponentially when they reopened the border, it was because many Spanish people went also to Gibraltar to buy cigarettes, to visit families, that because they have relatives also in Gibraltar, particularly in the surrounding area. So there were also Spaniards and people from other parts of Europe going there. But just to sum up, basically this idea of multiculturalism is what, this narrative of multiculturalism is what they use in order to distinguish themselves from, not just from the British that too, but from Spanish. Yeah. So thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. First of all, the GOP, it's been the most important organization of the civil society from the end of the 70s, and I think it is still. Because it's the one that has more able to mobilize more people, you know. Well, why I focus to this organization and to ecologism when I want to speak about tourism, when I want to talk about tourism? Well, it's because of the, first of all, of the importance of the ecologism in the civil society of Mallorca. And as a second question, what made me surprised was that the GOB has a political rhetoric anti-touristic. So when somebody tell me about the Mallorca Observed documentary from the BBC, the importance of it with the genesis of the GOB and the environmental movement in Mallorca, it was very surprising for me because, well, it's supposed to be even the ecologism in Mallorca is a tourist product, you know? Even the anti-tourists are a tourist product, culturally speaking. You know, it's a contradiction between it's political against tourism, is culturally a tourist product, no? And I think that it shows the powerful or the power of tourism in such a touristified society or country like Mallorca. You know, because even the ones that are against tourism, they are coming from the tourist identity and the tourist discourse. And yes, about the dichotomy, and that is interesting, this question, because it allows me to explain more. Well, that's a dichotomy, modernity, tradition. That's a dichotomy that everybody is trapped. No, everybody is a prisoner of this dichotomy. No, every country, perhaps, no, in relationship with tourism, but even not in relation to tourism. Well, in tourism, one thing that is particular, or perhaps in Spain, is that nor the Spain is different brand, nor the Francoist developist brand linked to modernity, nor this brand, neither the one linked to tradition, perhaps the brand of the Mallorca Observed. Both brands are not linked to politics. You know, the Spain is different. The Franco tourism is a modernity without politics, and it's something different to the typical binary opposition system. You know, and for me, the transgression of the left-winged tourist identity in Mallorca, the transgression is especially that we assume the traditional otherness, but at the same time we affirm our political agency, and that is not in the colonial tourist discourse. It's something that it doesn't fit, and for me it's the most important.
Okay, great. First of all, your English is very good. I don't know why you made that little intro. I also think, before I open the floor, I think what was interesting in all 4 papers, and I didn't mention it, is that this kind of, and I always struggled with this in the project, this post-45 as a beginning is completely arbitrary as a periodization, because what you actually see is continuity across the board in the thinking, and kind of a recurrent exchange of ideas from the early 20th century, late 19th century, up to the late 20th century. So it's interesting that kind of going back historically, they get ideas, and there seems to be this constant recurrence of, and some persistence of some of these ideas. And I think we tend to do that and have 45 as a stund de null moment, where actually in tourism that is not the case. And I think it's very hard to always have a beginning and an end because they keep on evolving. Okay, I've spoken enough. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Last but not least,
Okay.
my apologies.
No problem, no problem. Yeah, and in connection with that, with continuities, in fact, even in the case of socialist regimes, what we see is that there is a continuity when you're talking about people, right? So the same people, not necessarily at a higher level, but secondary, you know, so second tier officials or practitioners who are the same from the, you know, interwar 40s or 30s in the 50s. Okay, so to answer your question about who is in charge, right? So, well, I would say the state still has a role, but here is the question is how we define the state, right? So, who are the agents? And for communist regimes, usually when we look at the state, we only see the party. For Francoist regime, things are a bit more nuanced, right? So it was the Ministry of Information and Tourism, which was in charge with putting forth these policies, creating the skeleton for developing tourism, and then, you know, for kind of trying to suggest some tourist practices as well. But here, as I said, the question is, what is the role of second tier also, so decision-making process, which is something that I'm following in my project a lot, like, who makes the decisions, how are this implemented, and so forth. And practically it's not just the top tier, but also the second tier that I'm practically looking at. Okay, so how are these practices consumed? Well, here I think we have to talk about agency, right? So tourist agency in practically choosing whatever they want to pick from this overall discourse about tourism. So
But you mean the transnational one, big ones like Thomas Cook, or the national?
The national, I mean,
national,
so
okay.
yeah. So each country has, let's say, its own discourse about tourism, what it sells as, what it brands as national, what it considers, although there are similarities, right? So the folk culture is for sure one big similarity. But tourists are sometimes picky, right? They don't necessarily take everything, they kind of taking it against the grain, right? So they are very critical sometimes. So we should not take agency completely from them, because in tourist studies there is this idea that tourists in fact are like a crowd, like sheep. They just go and see things, and well, they have this tourist gaze, they look at things maybe in a different way. So when they visit something, they have, of course, different perspective than locals. But here I think we have to nuance things, and but do the tourists feel gratitude for offered services? Yeah, I guess, and probably it was also a way to. It was a question of power, right? So it was an issue of power. They noticed that these gifts kind of can buy some favors, and they were small, inexpensive stuff in fact, but they did mean a lot for the tourist workers in Romania, right? Because these were goods, objects from a world they didn't have access to. Even if it was, I don't know, a chocolate, right? It didn't mean anything, but it might not seem that it doesn't mean anything, but actually it meant a lot. And did the state really want to control? Well, I think it did, but it didn't have means. This is, something I'm also trying to elaborate on, and to show that.
But
even
did they recognize the lack of means?
Not officially, no, never, of course, right? But you see the chaos that they develop around, this attempt to control.
Yeah.
That'll be all.
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry for.
No, that was perfect. And I'm sorry for forgetting you. I don't know how that happened. Really sorry. Okay, let's open it up. Do we have any questions? Yes, I'll take it in groups. Let's start. Please present yourself so we can get to know each other and then ask the question. Yes, first here. Yes.
My name is Milos Nitic. I'm coming from Belgrade University. I love the presentation. I have only one. Thank you. I have many questions, but I'm going to pose only one to Christos. And it is more of a comment of yours that I'm expecting, because I rather like this idea of a static mess they were trying to sort out through the activities of the tourist police. So this a static mess. So would you say that today the Athenian apartment building, the famous Polykathikia, is an aesthetic mess that is in a way considered as something that needs to be taken care of when it comes to the image of Athens today? obviously many other questions, but I'm going to stop here. Thank you so much.
Okay, hold on so we can get another one. Who behind the Angelos? Yes. Take three at a time, okay?
So actually, I have no questions. I have a set of comments to make. So if you
Perfect.
allow me, you can at the end to make all of them or whatever you
No,
wish.
no, go ahead, go ahead.
Are you sure about that?
I'll catch you if you're over. Let's see how it goes.
Okay,
I think they will appreciate the
I'll try to
comments.
be brief, because they're enough. Starting from the end and addressing this to Anthony about the role of dictatorship in Greece and in Spain. Very briefly, I would say, in Spain, you have a dictatorship for so many years, for so many decades, while in Greece, you have two separate dictatorships, one in the 1936, 1940, while the other one's the colonial junta, 1967, 74. So they're different at the end, and they coincide with the start and the end of the Franco regime. Speaking about the latter one, allow me to insist on the latter one. At the case of Spain, I would argue that tourism was rather a vehicle to drag the country out of the European, of the isolation from the European Gulf, from the international community. While in the case of Greece, particularly at the Junta case, I would say it was a way to verify the country's role within this community officially. There is a slight difference, but maybe this is minor. Let me get to the most important one. This one is addressed to Irini. You made a very crucial question, which is at the very center of this debate. Who are the actors? Who are these key players? Allow me here to adapt the phrasing of a prominent scholar in tourism studies, a colleague historian, Sasapak. Sasapak used a very up to the point, let's say, argumentation, claiming that, and this applies at least in Greece, in Spain for sure, and maybe I would say in other Mediterranean countries, at the very first decades of 20th century, he claims, a group of elite, top-class tourism experts, they surfaced, they emerged in the Mediterranean countries, speaking the years between the First World War and the Second one, trying to bridge the gap between the market and the state policy. So this is a very, let's say, typical feature, and particularly speaking about Neris, because this was the key player. He's just a typical figure of a Greek bureaucrat, of a public servant having a career in Greece for so many decades under several regimes. This is exactly the case of all the top players in Greek tourism, whose the names are literally unknown. I'm speaking about Dimitri Papaystrateou, Nikolaos Lekas, Nikolaos Eginitis, to give but a few examples. All of them, they operated for decades, and insist on that, contrarily to what happened, for example, after the Greek junta, where you have changes, names all the time, you have people working in the public administration or from the market side for so many years, shaping, let's say, a solid identity. And a few more, let's say, comments also about Christos Alipradis, just to assist and maybe help this discussion by reminding some of his, let's say, arguments. Tourism police in 1935. Why? Because tourism police was a supplementary tool to the policy of GNTO, of the Greek National Tourism Organization, at the first stage, inaugurated in 1929, and it was part of the policy the GNTO officially has declared to the Greek government of Venizelos 1929-1930, though it was established a few years later. So it was part of a broader political agenda that did not come out of the blue. Another comment very typical of what you said about the tourism consciousness. Yes, through the 20s and the 30s, all around Greece, the newspapers, they were full of quotes like the one you presented us. Just to mention another one, you have people saying that tourism, like a flu, and patriotic duty is to get through this flu, all of us. So this was not just a isolated comment. It's full of in the public sphere. I totally agree with the crypto-colonial descriptions you gave, and I'm fully aligned with that. And the last of my comments, maybe it could serve in this debate. It was not just Neri's visit to fascist Italy and the state. It was Angelo Mariotti, who is the critical figure in Italian tourism under Mussolini from 1929 until 1970. Imagine, he started his career under Mussolini and he remained in his position in 1970. Who is the guy who came in Greece in the early 30s? He even wrote a book, who is totally lost, there's only one copy, speaking about this propaganda and about this policing issues and setting this, the context you gave us about the tourism police, among others. And it was Mariotti who let's say, backed up Neri's further argumentation. I think it's enough for now, and we have for sure space for further questions.
Perfect. It's Hui and then Jelena, and then we'll have to wrap it up because we're running late. Hui behind the glasses there.
Hi, I'm Hui. I'm a historian, and I have a brief historian question and a brief historian comment.
We're never brief.
It is. My question is for Adelina, and it is a Cold War question. I'm sorry, Irini. From what I gathered, the main, both questions have to do with targets, which, as Irini pointed out, I think is quite an interesting dimension of tourism. Who exactly are you trying to attract, and who are you sort of shaping your identity in order, what kind of appeal are you trying to design? So from what I gather, in the case of Romania, it seems to be like the main target were Western tourists and not tourists from the Eastern Bloc. And the way you put it, it seemed sort of the main reason for this was economic, which is obvious, very plausible, but I do have to ask, does it tie into sort of Ceausescu's renowned sort of enfant terrible diplomacy of also trying to be a bridge between the East and the West within the Western Bloc? Was there sort of like also a high politics dimension to this choice, or was it purely economic? And then my comment is for Louise, and it has to do with the fact that since the Gibraltar tourism agencies were specifically targeting British tourists, I'm not really sure what the difference is between sort of exploiting a colonial identity and just merely reinforcing an economic dependency, because it seems to be like a very sort of classic case of colonialism, with the local elites mediating between sort of the colonizers and the exploitation of the territory. And so it struck me that perhaps, if I'm not misreading it, what's quite interesting in the context of this panel is that your paper shows how tourism was not just a way of opening up, but also a way of sort of reinforcing and reestablishing borders.
Yeah, very good. And last one, Jelena, please.
Thank you all for very interesting presentations. To Christos, what education did these policemen had, and what is happening today? I mean, I don't seem to know that there is a tourist police, but it's probably good that they're invisible. Antoni, the Mallorca. It seems that there is no sea, so I want to ask you the relation to the sea. Okay, this is an island, and also Mallorca had many seamen and fleets and all of this. So that's my question, and it will be probably to most of the presentators. And Adelina, to compare Black Sea with Spanish Costa del Sol, it's excellent. I wanted to see more more comparison, which I did not understand very much. But for me, the comparison is much more important and would be very interesting between Maya, for example, Varna, and maybe today Batumi in comparison with this. But what is very interesting, I find, is to talk, well, we can talk later, but it's a transition from the socialist time to after 1990s. How did they, because these were the coastline of Soviet Union and all the socialist countries. So what happened there? And yeah, so, but I understand Romania and Bulgaria had more Western tourists than the rest of the Black Sea.
Okay, guys, let's start one by one. Try not to answer everything now. We only have 5 minutes. Take it in also to use it for the revision afterwards, but I'll give you all the floor, so answer whatever you want, okay? So we take it from Adelina and then we can have everyone.
Thanks a lot for your questions, both of you. Okay, so I'll start with a question about economics versus politics. Well, tourism started as an economic phenomenon in Romania because first of all, it started in the late 50s, right? When there was no idea about, political closeness to the West. Ceausescu was not in power yet. So practically tourist specialists, right? So the second tier that I was talking about were the ones to actually notice that, there are countries that are developing tourism and they're making money out of it. So maybe socialist countries could do the same. And this became like a topic of discussion among socialist countries, okay? And this is how it all started. So I would say the economic reason prevailed rather than the political one. To answer to Galina's question, the thing is that what I'm trying to achieve with this comparison is indeed to look at two different regimes to see how they approach tourism. But also there is this issue of periphery. So both countries were in fact peripheries to the European core. And for tourism, somehow they try to integrate. This is very obvious in the case of Spain, right? To overcome isolation, to become, even it was not necessarily intended from above, right? So it was something that an unintended consequence, right? The peaceful invasion of Spain. So I'm looking at how these two peripheries somehow integrated into Europe through tourism. And the question about Mamaia and Varna. Well, yes, it is a different project, I would say. Okay. And of course, there are similarities, geographical, also same political regime. Bulgaria somehow was developed even an earlier interest with tourism. For instance, just one example, in 1956, there was a British tourist agency that sold tourist tours to Romania and Bulgaria, but not just Bulgaria, it was also Austria, it was Paris, so all Europe. It was a left-wing tourist agency, okay? And Bulgaria was promoted through the Black Sea. Romania was promoted as through the Carpathians, right? So tourists could go and spend time at the Black Sea in Bulgaria and go to the mountains in Romania, right? So there's this chronological advance of Bulgaria. Yeah, so, but as I said, this is a different project that needs more than one person because I don't speak Bulgarian and I'm not a specialist on tourism in Bulgaria. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I'll try to be as brief as possible. First of all, to Milos. Well, that's the million-dollar question or comment that pushes me actually to be a bit more contemporary, even a bit more political. Because if you see what happens nowadays in Athens with the gentrification, of many areas, especially around the center, you can still see that development across the same lines of creating an as much as possible sterilized zone, so to speak, that is just for the tourists to enjoy, meaning this means that the prices go up and all the problems the inhabitants are pushing towards the margins, so to speak, in places that they can be at least say invisible to those who want to attract. That was the same thing with the 1920s mess, so to speak, as described by Neris. So the refugees from 1922 are not disappearing, but they're pushed away. And I'm very much afraid that the same thing is happening today with the Athens downtown inhabitants of, not even having the financial means. They cannot afford to stay in these downtown tourist zones, so to speak. Second, when it comes to career officials and mid-century tourism, once again, you hit the nail on the head. I would really say that it is these years, 1935 to 1950, that is the absolute crucial period for the emergence of central state tourist policies. And these are the policies that enable the later boom of tourism in the 50s, 60s. I was a little bit afraid that Irini might be quite displeased with that, of pushing, the very core of my research slightly at the beginning of the Cold War, a little bit earlier, maybe, but still I do locate in the 30s, 40s, the very, birth-giving dates of later on Greek tourist consciousness and Greek tourist policies. Also as regards the Italian-Greek connection and knowledge transfer. And there is, yes, oh, thank you, sorry, Jelena. When it comes to tourism, education, and tourist police, the tourist policemen receive the same education as the rest of the city's police and the gendarmerie. Unfortunately, we are not able to know what exactly they learned because the Central State Police Archives are currently closed and inaccessible to the Greek public. At this point, I should also mention that it was not only the gendarmerie and the city police, but also the port police, the limeniko, which also took part in the tourist police, but I didn't have the time to mention that in the presentation. So hopefully my research is not suffering from maritime blindness. Hopefully so. And when it comes to tourist police nowadays, it does exist. Yes, they carry little badge over there saying tourist police. They even have bikes in downtown Athens. But I do think that the presence is more vital to the foreigners in Greece and not very much for us who live in the country. But they do exist, yes. Perhaps the fact that they are somewhat invisible contributes to their increased efficiency.
Also, very briefly, thank you for your interesting comment, because it's exactly the key element that I'm struggling with, because one of the problems in the case of Gibraltar is that in the wave of decolonization, Gibraltarians decided to remain under the colonial power with some autonomy, of course, but they didn't want to be independent. So that is the exceptional case. So what you have is that despite that they had self-governing institutions already in the 1950s, it's difficult to see a difference with the colonial authorities, because they were cooperating for the same thing. That is the reason that makes quite difficult to research on Gibraltar many times, because you can distinguish what is the colonial authority and who is Gibraltarian, So that is the problem. So very, very good comment. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. The question about the sea, of course, the sea is present, but it's more present in relation to the brand. I don't talk about. It's very present in the brand of Francoist development, the beach, the practice of bathing is very important in the Francoist development brand of Spain is different. I centered my presentation on the other brand linked to the left-wing politics in Mallorca. And this other brand is more linked to trekking, to practice of trekking, to the mountains, to the enjoying the landscape, and of course, as a view the sea is there. But it's not so important than with the practice of bathing and the tourism of sun and beach. And about the fact of that Mallorca is an island and the issue of the insularity, I think what makes an island so attractive in tourism is not only sand and beach, or is not only the sea, but the fact that it is represented, it is perceived from the continent as an isolated place, as a separated place, where politics, social conflict don't reach this place. It's a separated place. And tourism is been historically, I think, a practice of escapism of everyday life from in the departure society. And one thing that most tourists escape is from work, of course, and from politics as well, or social conflicts, you know?
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. We have 10 minutes, unfortunately, for some coffee, which is at the garden, that's right. And please join me in thanking what were 4 amazing presentations. Thank you so much.